thank you for being here. I'm really grateful that you're here. In a lot of ways, I don't really feel like I'm a professional on this subject, but really just a kind of a fellow journeyer here. So it's my hope that we can share with each other, kind of share some best practices at the end. Our title today is More Tables and Fewer Walls. If you know me, you've probably seen this a bit. I've done some teaching on refugee resettlement ministry, and I use this title, and I've found myself using this title for a lot of the work that I'm doing, More Tables, Fewer Walls, and I think it's because it really is kind of a part of my DNA, and it's a way that I see the gospel. And so you may have seen this, the main title, the subtitle, of course, is Navigating a Politically Divisive Context, which I think is on everyone's mind. Please come in, welcome. Yeah. Sure.
Two of them right up here in the front row.
We have some in the middle. I think we can squeeze in.
I'll scoot in.
Y'all are practicing hospitality, which is going to go well here.
You have to.
Thank you and welcome.
I can take one. Oh, I can take two.
Robin, there's one.
Party after we have to tell our people every Sunday to scoot in.
You all need to spread the seats out a little to accommodate. That's just fine. Well, my name is Reverend Rich Shockey, which I always thought was a bit of an oxymoron. They call me Reverend. But I'm an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene. I've been Nazarene for 20 years. I grew up atheist, and I was born in the projects, and I was born into a home where there was a lot of darkness and a lot of abuse in my context, a lot of substance abuse. Just lost my third cousin to heroin overdose last year. I saw a lot of hard things growing up. I saw a lot of hopelessness, a lot of darkness. So it's a real privilege and joy for me to be in the position that I'm in, and to help to point others to the hope that we have in Christ. I serve, my day job is I serve as a executive director of operations for Marketplace Chaplains, which is just a fancy way of saying that I chaplain chaplains in the workplace. I also am a foster parent. I've put a picture of my beautiful children up here. This is Timmy's 14, Jonah's 12, soccer player, artist. We were foster parents for 12 years and just decided to hang up our hat last year. I serve on the board with United Methodist Youthville, which is a foster agency in Kansas. I also serve on an interfaith action group in Kansas. I work for Kansas Interfaith Action on their board, and we do advocacy in Topeka, legislative advocacy. And I'm also one of the founders of Nazarenes United for Peace. So if you've ever seen any of their social media stuff floating around, you can blame me for some of it. And I just put my social media contacts up here. I don't know that I say anything too terribly interesting. If you follow me on Instagram, you're mostly going to get pictures of food because I love to eat, and probably pictures of my kids because they're so cute. So, anyway, just a little bit about me. So I want to talk a little bit about the deepening divide. You know that us as Wesleyans, we know this thing called the Via Media, the middle way. That's been expressed in a lot of different ways. The way that we try to take a centering place. Now that has some very specific theological implications in the history of the church. But I think for us, many ways, it's a model for us not to be drawn to polarities. And I just found this silly political cartoon that just kind of highlighted the state. Please come in. Yeah, please come in. Oh, was it locked?
Fewer walls. Fewer walls.
We're closed. Closed. So sorry.
We'll get her saved.
I thought that this really helped illustrate kind of how the political state of America looks these days. And I don't think it's just America. We've seen a rise of deepening political divides across the world in several different cultures and countries. My concern, of course, is that we tend to withdraw and we polarize and that there are many formative things in our culture that push us to polarize and draw away from one another. We withdraw into silos, we retreat into tribes, pardon the phrase. We make enemies out of one another. We become suspicious of each other, which I think is natural to us in some ways, at least in a fallen kind of way. And I think sometimes we have a belief that there isn't enough for everyone, which I think drives a lot of our conversations about how we relate to one another culturally and nationally. Polarization has become the norm. Just this move into your corner. You find your corner, you decide who you're going to be, and choose that corner. I thought it was interesting, a blog post mentioned this as a model for a kind of a middle way. It's from Joshua 5:13-14. Is on the eve of a battle for Joshua, an angel shows up. And remember, an angel is not doesn't have wings floating around, but this is like a person who is delivering a message. Are you for us or our adversaries? Joshua asked. And the angel replied, neither. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And I think Joshua's question, please come in. Joshua's question is kind of at the root of a lot of our suspicion of one another. We want to quickly assess someone. Are you for us or are you against us? Are you on my team or are you on the other team? Do you have an R or a D? Do you follow the donkey or do you follow the elephant? Do you believe this way on this issue or do you believe that way on that issue? There's no middle ground.
Well, but it's even more so now because we have a tendency to categorize people. So now it's easy to get past a Republican or Democrat or the conservative and the liberal.
Right.
Now we're getting into the generational aspect.
Yeah.
Boomers, okay, boomer, to millennials, and I don't know what's before, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it gets even past. Then that doesn't even throw in culture or race or gender or anything like that.
Yeah, you're not wrong. We have lots of categories for one another, places, particular issues, where do you stand on this? And the tendency, I think, is for us to withdraw to people who are like us. It's comfortable there, right? We like to be with people who are like us, they have the same values as us, maybe even look the same way that we do, eat the same foods that we do, value the same foods, the same things that we do. Apparently I have food on the brain. Did I mention you can follow my Instagram for great food and recipes?
But the thing is, once two people that didn't know each other 30 seconds previous find something in common, after a while they will find somebody to bash.
Yeah.
Commonly.
Yeah, you're not wrong. We have a tendency then to get together so that we can make an enemy out of somebody else, right? Let's define ourselves by the things that we are against, and so that we can put a face on that to make them an enemy. Soccer parents are the worst. I never played soccer, but I'm a soccer dad now, whether I wanted to be or not. That's my son Timmy. I just tried to find a good picture of him doing it. I cut off his foot, but he's actually like this far off the ground, which is pretty cool. I told him he's like Jesus. He's that's a cool trick he did there, walking on water. He's a great kid and does a great job. But the worst part about soccer is me. What happens to me when I watch my kid play soccer. It's been a long formative process for me to work out my sanctification, maybe even work out my salvation on the sideline. Because you know what happens, don't you? Right? I mean, even if you're not an athletic person or have kids that are athletes or whatever, you probably have a team, right? And you have people who your team are playing against. And sometimes it's fun and good-natured and ha, those Broncos fans or Raiders fans or whatever. But this happens in a very real way, and it's not funny on a soccer sideline when people who would normally be friends, even like some people that I know on another team, all of a sudden, well, I'm for my team, and that ref is against my team, and they're calling, the calls are bad, the refs are terrible, they're biased against us. And then you hear somebody say, oh, that's a terrible call. And then you hear a dad go, that's a great call. And so you find there's this deepening divide that happens on the soccer field. And then they turn and become enemies of one another. And I get sucked up in it. I've been doing this thing for a lot of years, and I still find myself thinking, this guy's ridiculous down there. Like, great job, And I find myself then beginning to make enemies out of people who would normally be my friends. And I wonder if all of the things that happen around us in our world do that thing to us, where the things that we see and experience in media or in friends or at work or on TV or in political ads or in cable news channels, that they push us deep into corners so that we can make enemies out of one another and give us, as Brian said, common enemy. I think that we have forgotten that it's not only what we believe, but how we hold our beliefs. What good is it? Come in. Feel free to come in if you need. We got a couple chairs if you want to come in.
I'm just counting.
Oh, okay, no problem. 97.
Okay.
I mean, preacher stats. It's not just what we believe, but how we hold those beliefs. What good is it if we're right about all the right things and we beat people over the head with our rightness, right? What if the conflict that we have is opportunity? I loved what Pastor Eddie spoke about this morning, because he really kind of teed us up well, didn't he? To think about grace and the way that God sometimes is, God's grace is in all of those places along our journey. It's been drilled into us so much not to talk about religion and politics that I think we've forgotten how to disagree agreeably. I don't know if that's true in your family, but in my family, it's okay at dinner, you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about politics. And if you try, it gets really ugly really fast. I mean, how many of you have anxiety through the holidays that you're going to see a relative where you're like, I hope they don't talk about this issue or that candidate or this perspective, or like we have a sense of anxiety that we may have a conflict that we won't be able to overcome. And I think as the church, we ought to be practitioners of disagreeing agreeably, because we are the ones who are called to come to the table in all of our diversity and be made one. Not to flatten out the things that make us diverse, and I'm just going to ignore that you're this political party when we go take communion together. But in the midst of our diversity together, in the beauty of that, we're able to come to the table. So there's a guy named A.J. Sherrill, pastor. I believe he's pastoring over at Mars Hill, if I remember correctly. No, that's no endorsement of him or his churches, but he has some writings on this idea of horizontal unity that I found really helpful. We have a tendency, I think, to think positionally, right? Where do you stand on this position? The kind of the things we talked about. Where do you stand on immigration? Where do you stand on a border wall? Where do you stand on late-term abortion? Where do you stand on birth control? Where do you stand on race relations? What's your stand? And so imagine, take any particular issue, and I think you can find a place. A friend posted a test on testing to find out where you lie on a spectrum, politically. Like you answer your thoughts about certain beliefs, and it plots you right on a line. And so we've had a tendency to do this, but there could be some helpful analysis in this. But I think we often do this with others, right? Like where do you stand? Where do my people stand? Or maybe we even do this theologically with people in our churches and their discipleship. Like, oh, well, you think that? Well, we're Nazarenes, we're Wesleyans, or you're just really not supposed to think that as a Christian. Right? We have a tendency to decide who's a friend and who's an enemy by the position that they are on the spectrum. I think more often than not, we choose who we will include at our tables based on whether or not they agree with our positions. This is really hard, isn't it? We choose who to include at our tables based on whether or not they agree with our positions. I'm afraid, I think that in some ways the evangelical church, so this is kind of all of us, right? We've kind of fell in love with that church growth movement of, I don't know, 1980s and later. And there are some great things from the church growth movement. We all want our churches to grow, of course. But some of the core tenets of the church growth movement were that people like to be with people who are like themselves, so put people with people who are like them, and your church will grow. So that's when we had Saddleback Sam. Remember that idea that came from purpose-driven? I mean, there are some benefits to that. But then they said, okay, that's our target. We're going to target people who look just like Saddleback Sam. When I was serving at Bonner Springs, I did a caricature of that called Wyandotte Willie, and it was terribly sinful. But it made me realize the futility of that. But we kind of do that too in our churches, where we say, well, let's attract young families with children. Money's the code, right? But this affinity group, this homogeneous unit principle, I think has been one of the primary deformative aspects of Christianity in the 20th century. Where we thought it was best for us to just be with people who are like us because we'll be more comfortable and we'll grow more. And there's certainly some good to that. I mean, Eddie mentioned it this morning, like it's good to be with people who are on the same journey as you. You know, when I was a young parent, I was drowning. Oh, it was terrible. I didn't have any cousins. I didn't, I didn't have any brothers and sisters. I'd never been around kids. You know, it was like a baby that cries and eats and poops and sleeps. Like, I don't know what to do with this thing. I was lost. It was really helpful for me to be with people who were like me, who were kind of at the same place along the journey. But that cannot be the only way that we arrange ourselves when it comes to our Christian community. It is radically important that we be with people who are not like us, especially if, not in spite of, but especially if they disagree with us on our positions. Now, I'm not saying that we should not hold particular positions. That's not to say, well, as a Christian, you ever should take a stand. Or that's not to say if someone is abusive or harmful to the community that we don't say, this is a safe space and you are not allowed to bring your poison here. That's a bit of a different story, so don't misread what I'm saying. But I think the table of Christ is intended to be a place where we are made one by the power of the Holy Spirit. Not a thing that we create ourselves, but a thing that we come together to celebrate and to be formed into the kind of people who make longer tables for people who are not like us. And say, come, let me find out how Jesus is working in your life so that I can learn how God might work in my life, or God might work in the community around me. Yep.
And I think we mistake unity for uniformity.
You're right.
You know, they ain't like us, so they don't do it that way. Mm-hmm. Something like that, whereas if they're like-minded, they just do it differently.
That's a whole session, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
You left the door.
Unity and not unity. Yeah. And the Bible doesn't say that we are to be uniform in any way, but to have unity. So AJ goes on to provide an alternative to that horizontal positioning, this horizontal unity, this idea that the only way we can arrange ourselves is if we have these very tight boundaries for one another. And he calls it vertical unity, which he describes as posture, which I really like, this idea of posture. That it is not so much about where you stand on positions or what group you align yourself with, or whatever it is that your cultural identifier is. A generational demographic, came to mind. But it is our posture and our degree of openness to the work of God in our relationship to God and our relationship with others. So he has this, and so he lays out some descriptors here, that a posture that is open to God and to others is humanizing. We did a Nazarenes United for Peace has been doing a blog series called Rehumanize, the Rehumanize Project. It's this idea that all that's happening in our culture seeks to dehumanize meaning to ignore or denigrate the image of God in others, a dehumanization. On the contrary, the gospel is rehumanizing. It recognizes that my enemy, you, are made in the image of God. And that it is my duty to recognize the divinity and the humanity in you, in rehumanizing you. It is humanizing. It is gracious. Aren't we just attracted to people who are gracious? I love being around people who just spill out grace. Not a grace that allows harm or grace that is lawless, so to speak. But I think we all know gracious people in our lives. I can name 5, actually, just kind of like on this floor. I know where they are, who I want to be more like because of their graciousness. And curiosity. I thought this is interesting. You ever think about this as a value, as a Christian value? Curiosity. I won't ask. Don't raise your hands. This is rhetorical. Did your church encourage curiosity when you were a kid?
No.
I want to be generous. I want to be gracious to the past, to our parents who were doing their best for those that raised us in church. But I would venture to say curiosity is not encouraged in a lot of our kind of systems of discipleship. But this is part of this posture of openness to God and openness to others, curiosity. I just want to pause there. I just want to ask you all that question. What does that mean to you to be spiritually curious, or to be curious in that way? Give me your thoughts on it. I just want to hear what you think.
Why somebody thinks that way.
Yeah. What a simple question to ask. Like, tell me why you think that way. That's new to me.
And that's key. So if someone brings up a position that you 180 degrees away from, say somebody says, I'm pro-abortion. Okay? Then you can say, just say, explain to me how that works.
Yeah.
How do you get there? Because if you can understand, when you do the same thing for studying other cultures, which missionaries should do when they go, before they go overseas, they study that culture. Because you could, if you understand a person, how they think, you can influence them to do something for you. Now you can do that for the good or for the bad. But if you spend time and study somebody, if I spend 5 minutes with you, Rick, I can influence you to do something for me. And you'll like doing it. More times than not.
And maybe we have something to learn too.
Absolutely.
Maybe God has something to say to us.
How does that work for you? I go a lot of places. I spent my career with people who didn't look like me, and it changed me. It taught me what love was in a way I never would have if I'd stayed with where my friends went.
Some say discipleship is learning how to practice love.
You know,
It's the practice.
quite a few years ago, the Lord told me, well, you just don't need to stay with your church family all the time. Get out and get. So I started playing bridge and started playing dominoes and things where I'm with other people. And you do get those people that you don't understand, so it gives you yesterday, I said something about having a revival at our church, and this one lady, she's very social-minded. Oh, she says, revival, I didn't know they had those anymore. And I said, I don't like to call it revival, I said, either. I like to call it renewal. I agreed with her and disagreed at the same time, or explained my view on it. And we never got in an argument. I could get in arguments with her because she's very vocal.
Well, yeah.
I don't know that we win a lot of people into the kingdom by arguments. I was an atheist for 20 years, and there were a lot of arguments, telling me why I was wrong, why I was a sinner.
Someone listened to you finally?
I think it's like to be curious spiritually, it's more that you're interested to listen more than to speak about your position. Because sometimes you think like I am right, like my church is right, I want that you will be on some same page with me, and you do it without love, and sometimes like one example, in my country, I'm from Ukraine, so it's why I'm interested about this class. It's a lot of cultural difference here, and even like Christian culture, you know, like one hot topic about gays and lesbians. Yeah, in Ukraine, people, even not believers, hate this. Like absolutely, they will say it's wrong. They will say radical positions about this. They will not like hit people, but they will say I not agree with it. Like here, I see like some churches liberal, moral, and if I will say this, like you know, you're wrong. Like it will be, yes, it is, but it will be without love, you know. So it's like, and I don't listen to this person. Like what is his opinion, and he don't feel love from me. So I will say like, hey, you are wrong, and this and this and this scripture, you know, and it will be like he said like, hey, I mean, I can know this too, but I don't feel that you are my friend, you know. So I think it's about this, you know, to be polite to people that they have not, they don't, so they have just another opinion. They don't, they not doesn't like you. So they like you, but they have another opinion, and you should be like polite about this, curious about this, and be listener more than speaker at this point.
I like that. Well, you remember? Oh, go ahead, Tyrone.
I think it's really fascinating when you look at those three things: humanizing, gracious, and curious. Just how godly those three things are, and how biblical those three principles are. And I'm just looking at this and thinking about the idea of curiosity and being curious. And I firmly believe that a lot of people don't want to be curious when it comes to learning more about Christ because they're afraid that it will make them have to change some of the things that they have believed for a long time. And like I said, I just find that fascinating because as Christians, we believe that we experience new mercies every day. We experience new grace every day. And so I think that being curious should be like an overpouring of our relationship with Christ. If we have a relationship with Christ where we're growing and the Holy Spirit is working within us, then we're going to have new questions. We're going to continue to grow in our curiosity towards the things of God, because I mean He's a God of unsearchable depth and riches. So I would encourage all of us, and myself included, to not shy away from being curious, and to look for those opportunities to learn from other people, even if they don't have those same thoughts or beliefs that we have. And I would also say, I don't know if you're going to get to this, but if you look at the downward postures, and you might be able to speak to this with your experiences being an atheist, but I feel like if you were to ask people who were not in church, or people who were not followers of Christ, what are some of your thoughts and just perceptions of believers? I mean, you see things that are more towards the closed-minded, the critical, the hypocritical, the dehumanizing, than you do towards the humanizing grace and curiosity. And I think that's should be a wake-up call for all of us as people in this room who profess to be followers of a God who's a God of love.
So, since you asked the question, this is why I'm Nazarene. And when I tell my story, like, how did you come to faith? I said, well, I've been preached at a lot. I've been told I was wrong and been argued, you know, whatever. About, you know, we can prove the existence of God, okay, whatever. But it was the people who loved me, and I was pretty unlovable. I was a horrible person. I did horrible things. And the Nazarenes, it was a senior high church camp, Southwest Ohio. They loved me. I saw them loving God, I saw them loving each other, and I experienced them loving me. And that was different from what I had experienced before, and that's the thing that changed me. Now, the prevenient grace, I just want to mention, do you believe, as Eddie mentioned this morning, prevenient grace, this is a core essential doctrine for us Nazarenes. Do you believe that the grace of God is operative in all of the people around you, then ought that not change the way that we interact with people around us? Even
Yes.
those who we think are dead wrong?
Yes.
Because we believe that God is at work and has something to say maybe even to us through them, even in the wrongness. Aaron?
I really like the vertical line. It really has spoken to me because it's not, this is the side of one party versus another party. It's the side of, like, anybody can be up here and anybody can be down here. And I feel like that it's the mission of, like, the corporate evil to push all further down to dehumanize each other. And I feel like that's something we just don't like to acknowledge.
Yeah.
That it's like it's the mission of others, of the evil, for us to feel like this about each other, critical, and then ultimately dehumanized.
It's convicting.
Couple
Okay.
quick thoughts. One, as far as curiosity goes, I think seeking objectivity is really important, which is getting out of our own context and and empathy, trying to see things from the other side, like actually seeking, like and can't be afraid to be willing to learn something or even be swayed. Like, I mean, you can't be afraid of that. Otherwise, there's no way for you to really get to their side of things. Like, if you're really going to let yourself, get over there and try to see where they're coming from, then you've got to be willing to step out of your comfort zone a little bit. And two, I think, and maybe you're going to talk about this, Rich, but I think the humanizing, dehumanizing spectrum that we're talking about is, I think it's made easier through social media, where a lot of these conversations happen. Yep. It's really easy to dehumanize
Yep.
someone when you're twice removed from them, because
Yep.
you've got one machine in front of you and they've got one machine in front of them. And so I see a lot of that, the dehumanizing, just nastiness, where
Yep.
people come at each other. They do it, but they're never face to face. They're
That's
never
right.
looking each other in the eye. And so their otherness is amplified, right?
That's
Because
right.
they are unable to see the real person
Yep.
that is actually on the other end of that keyboard
Yep.
or thumbs or whatever.
I'm confident I get it wrong. Two more. Pastor Ane? And then-
I think the thing that is so humanizing about us is that we have emotions. And if we can trace, whether it's the emotion around the Thanksgiving table, because it's easy to talk ideas, but can we talk with our family about how we feel? If we don't have that language, of course it's going to be easier to argue ideas. Real intimacy is you and me here and now. And unless we can talk at that personal level, face to face, it's all going to stay in the idea, rightness, wrongness, up or down, whatever.
That's
I really like the vertical and the horizontal, and I think it's fair to say that if what you are doing, if the end result is disunity, then Christ's goal for you is toppled.
Well, I want to think a bit about what it is that's happening physiologically when we disagree with others. So think of an issue that's emotionally galvanizing. So what really gets you? Like, you see a news story, you see it on Facebook, you've got a friend who brings it up, or a crazy uncle, that's probably me. Whatever the issue, right? Now imagine sitting across the table from that person, right, who you vehemently disagree with. So this is your practice. This is your imaginative practice. Imagine you're there. How do you feel? And can you listen with openness? Like, theoretically I can talk about this, but there are a few. Now sometimes it's bound up in hurt, and that makes it difficult. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that for some of these things, it's the relationship with the person that's the problem. It's not really the issue, and that's important, right? Like, let's not talk about gun control, friend, until we deal with this thing that I've had with you that we need to resolve first, right? Because it could be that thing, and we're just fighting about other things because we've got some underlying stuff we need to take care of, right? But there's some things that happen in your brain. We know the amygdala, that's where we, a lot of our instincts lie in our brain to react viscerally to these things. These things happen, our brain does this thing for a reason, but I think we have to be aware of that. A position that you hold that matters immensely. But I think part of the discipleship journey, if you will, or spiritual formation, is thinking about the role of what's happening in our body. Have you ever been aware of what happens? So I'll go back to the soccer thing. At one point, I realized I get really thirsty during Timmy soccer games. Do you know why? Because my adrenaline is going up. For a few reasons, not just because I'm mad at other parents who are being goobers. But some of it's because, like, I want my son to win, I want him to do well. But I would get thirsty, like I'm having a visceral bodily response. And if I'm ever in a conversation and I noticing what's happening in my body, you know, my kid's therapist will say this, like, where do you feel those feelings? And I feel them here, right? For some of us, it's our breathing. Some of it's our stomach. Sometimes we feel an urge to go to the bathroom. Sometimes a headache. Trembling. Have you ever been so mad that you've done this, right? Like to sense where in your body things are happening and to recognize the spirit-body connection and how it is that we're responding to one another. So you all, I know most of you here, your teachers and leaders in your churches, when you're teaching your people how to develop spiritually, we cannot forget some of the things that happen physiologically that I think also can be transformed by the Holy Spirit. Okay, so I've got some practical things. I don't want to just talk all theory, and you know we can all point to all of the things that are wrong or that need some help. And so I've got some ideas for us. And the first is hospitality. I've been heavily influenced. There's a book, Christine Pohl, on hospitality that was considerably formative for me. My mentor in ministry was LeBron Fairbanks, president of Mount Vernon Nazarene University for several years. He took it upon himself to be my spiritual dad, because I didn't have spiritual parents. And so when I went to college, he was my dad, and they took me in for holidays. And then guess what? They moved to Kansas City 10 years ago and became grandparents to my kids. And he kept working with me and loving me. He works a lot in leadership development, in hospitality as leadership. Not just opening our hearts, but creating room and making space for others and their thoughts and feelings. Imagine, like, if you have a guest coming to visit, what do? Like, you make their bed, you make sure their room's clean, you may bake some bread, or you may, all the touches that you do to help someone, even if you're not kind of like really into that thing, you still think about some of the things that you do to make your guests feel welcome, because you're creating room and you're making space for them, because that communicates something about their dignity and about their value. Well, in the same way, I think this is a spiritual practice for us, that the way we treat one another should be marked by hospitality. To say, come into this room. This is your space. God wants to work in it. Let me hold that space open for you and let us see what God does.
And it can be simple as just a cup of coffee for hospitality. It doesn't have to be all the things I can't do anymore. But
that's right. And I think this connects to that vertical idea that it's a posture of hospitality. It doesn't mean that I can't stand on principles. I believe in these things. Strangers become friends in hospitality. We listen with no judgment. That's really hard to do. And we respect the dignity and the humanity of the guests. I mentioned this earlier. We believe every person carries in them, they bear the image of God, because every single person is created in the image. This is where we differ in many ways from our Reformed brothers and sisters who primarily see people as sinners. You're a sinner. That's your primary identity is sinner. No, beloveds. Your primary identity is beloved child of God, created in God's image, in love, and forgiveness in this world. Recognizing that in others is critical, hospitality. And it's kind of funny that I use a big word when I talk about humility. So forgive this, but epistemic humility, epistemic just means like the way we know something. Epistemological is kind of another way of talking about that. Epistemic humility, meaning, are you sure about what you know? I mean, I'm sure about Jesus. I'm sure Jesus rose from the dead. I'm sure that Jesus saved me. I'm sure of those things. But I think there's a place where we cross over into an overconfidence about our ability to do it ourselves. Like, I don't need any interpretation of the Bible. I'm just going to read it myself, and I don't need a church to tell me what to believe because I just got me in the Bible, and that's enough. Well, it sounds like a good thing on the surface, perhaps. But we recognize our own fallenness and our own ability to intuit truth on our own. We are saved together. The church is called out together so that we can discern the will of God together. That's epistemic humility. This means that we hold our convictions loosely. That doesn't mean that you can't have convictions, but hold them loosely. Now, for those of you who've been around for a while, I won't ask you to say who you are. Are you different than what you were 20 years ago as a believer? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, maybe you learned a couple things along the way. I was a jerk when I was 20. I had been a Christian for a year, and I knew everything. Bible students, sorry, that was me. I'm just going to point to me here. I'm not pointing at any of y'all. I knew a lot. And when I got out of college, I really knew a lot. And that made it really hard for me to minister in my first church because I was kind of a jerk. Recognizing that we need to hold our convictions loosely. Remembering our own journey, that what are the things that helped us grow? I mean, it's not that there weren't hard places, but it's the people who did what? They held space for us. They let us wrestle with our convictions. They let us know that God is in the wrestling in as much as God is in the resolution. Admit when we're wrong. I'm really terrible at that. I'm admitting it though. So. And recognize that we need each other and that we're better together. So many of you that I know here, you're different from me. And I really like that. I have a lot to learn from you. Listen to understand. I'm kind of bad at this too, I think. I'm bad at so much of this. I'm thinking about what I want to say next. Part of that's human nature, right? Because you're synthesizing the information that you're hearing. But I think there can come a place where we're done listening. Because would you just stop talking so I can say what I've got to say next? We've been there, right? And see that God can be working in their process, which affirms the prevenient grace of God. God's grace is active in every single person that you come into contact with. And the last is to be centered on Jesus. Have you heard this idea of the bounded set and centered set? I know this gets talked a lot in spiritual circles. I don't have an illustration, but just imagine two kind of ideologies. A bounded set is this idea. So if I had a whiteboard, I do have a whiteboard with a marker, but it's really small. So I'll make it really small. Imagine that you have a circle, and Jesus is at the center. And the goal of your evangelism and your discipleship and your leadership and all the things you do is to get people from the outside of the circle to the inside of the circle. So you're not saved or you are saved. And so our goal, sorry, let's make that a smiley or a face, right? So our goal is to get somebody from the outside to the inside. And there are boundaries, and you have to think the right things and believe the right things and look the right way and wear the right clothes and whatever it means to be the cultural identifiers to be in the in-group. So in a bounded set ideology, it's the idea that we got to move you from the outside to the inside. So I need to get you to think the right things. And maybe even this comes in the way that we ask people to pray to receive Jesus, right? If you just believe these right things or think these right things, okay, you're good. You're in. The centered set idea erases this line. Now that's not to say that there aren't boundaries to our faith, or that there aren't limits to our orthodoxy. But it's more one of orthopraxy, meaning our practice. And that part of the goal of evangelism, discipleship, leadership in the church, however we frame that, is primarily one of orientation. That our job is not necessarily to move somebody from the outside to the inside, but to move somebody who was like me, facing completely the opposite direction from Jesus and all that I was doing in my life, and to help orient me closer to the heart of Jesus, to help me see and know and understand and grasp the heart of Jesus. Orienting people towards Jesus, not just getting them inside our ideological circle. And there's another one here that I think is really important. Anybody familiar with Brene Brown's work? She's done tremendous work on shame. She has this work that she does on assuming that others are doing the best that they can with what they know. Now, we know that's not always true. Some people are not always, like they're making deliberate choices to do harm to others. But wouldn't it help if we start with the idea, you know what, they're doing the best they can. This has helped me tremendously in my mother. I love you, Mom. To recognize that we all have had failures as a parent, and what do we want our kids to do? To really recognize that we were doing the best we could with what we had. It's really helped me to love my mom better. See, you know what? She's doing the best she could with what she had. How would that change us if when we interact with our enemies, if we think they're doing the best they can with what they know? To truly love them in that space, right? I really like this. I was just looking for some art. This is beautiful. It's the baptism of Jesus. I'm sorry I didn't put the name of the artist on here to give him credit, but I thought we could even just sit and contemplate this for an hour, and I think we could learn so much. But I thought it was appropriate. I don't know who said this. Somebody smarter than me did, and it stuck in my head, and now I can't remember who it was, and Google didn't help. We should spend more time convincing others of their belovedness rather than their wrongness.
That's how Jesus did.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure that convincing is really the right word there, but I think it at least gets to the point. And I mentioned I drew upon the baptism of Jesus because think if you've not read any Henry Nouwen on this, please read some Henry Nouwen on the baptism of Jesus. That it's here that God said, the Father said to Jesus, "This is my beloved, in whom I'm well pleased." And for all of us, by virtue of your baptism, you hear God calling you beloved. Life of the Beloved, Henry Nouwen. If you haven't read it, you can enjoy it. The baptism of Jesus. We should spend more time convincing others of their belovedness rather than their wrongness. All right, well, I've got a few other solutions, and then we'll chat a little bit more. I'm coming up to the end here. We mentioned a few of these, but one very practical one, and maybe you can think about ways to do this in your church. What are the things that you do personally and programmatically and systematically in your communities of faith? What do you do to get to know people who are not like you? And not just inviting them in, like, come to my church and, come be like us. But to really get to know people who are not like you. Like, do you spend a lot of time talking about, I don't know, how much, whatever our position is on any particular issue, I won't digress into particular ones, but whatever it might be, how much time are we spending in the communities that are affected by the particular position that we have, right? If we're railing a lot about immigration, are we spending time in immigrant communities? Do we have perspectives about Muslims? Do we know any Muslims? Are we doing life with them? Are we eating their food and sitting at their tables and holding their babies? Right? Do we have particular perspectives about the poor, how they ought to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and try harder? Are we spending time with poor people? If we have attitudes about if we have perspectives on gun violence, are we spending time with people affected by gun violence? And that doesn't mean you can't hold the position that you have, but our theology changes when we come into contact with the people affected by our theologies. And if not, it's completely disconnected. It's not incarnational. This is incarnational theology. I love the word incarnation. You see the root word there, carne, right? Spanish speakers, that's meat, right? I know that one. The enfleshment of Jesus. Sorry, I came back to food again. Man. Now I'm on video, so the whole world will know again. The enfleshment. This is enfleshed gospel. When we get to know people who are not like us, it does not do us much good when we just hang out with people. It's a little harder. It's a little more uncomfortable, right? It's more than just going to the visitors at your church and shaking their hand, right? Not that that's a bad thing to do. Here's another. So, yeah, I did this at the end, didn't I? So if you don't get mad at me, you got to go to your next workshop. All of them. All of them. Because what cable news wants to do is make money from you. I'm not saying there aren't good journalists in cable news. Maybe there are. Maybe there are some people who have integrity in what they do in cable news. But if you watch what happens, they set one person over here that has one opinion, then they find somebody over here who has the direct opposite opinion, and what do? They start fighting with each other. What do they want you to do? They want you to pick a side. That's cable news. We should be helping our people recognize the formative influence that cable news has on their theology. I'm not talking about bias. I'm not even yet talking about the partisan bias of any particular cable news source. I'm not talking about Fox News bias or MSNBC bias or CNN bias. I'm not even talking about bias, and there's room to talk about bias, trust me. But I'm just simply saying that there is a formational element in the format of cable news. It's image-driven, it's 30-second sound bites, it is not shaping us towards the gospel, friends. Now, good journalism, really important. And I think postmodernity has taught us we can't just simply throw off our biases and say, I'm free from my biases, I'm reading this without any bias. But to own our biases, to recognize our bias, to read a broad variety of sources. One of the biggest, from a news consumption perspective, one of the most important things I did was I started paying attention to news sources outside of the country. Like, that was pretty radical for me. Like, wow, the perspective on Americans around the world. News is formational, very formational. And have you seen the stats on the amount of formation that people have in cable news? Compared to what's happening in churches, people are being formed at least 10 times more from a time perspective from the cable news sources than they are by the church. This is important. And finally, and Kyle left. Somebody have to tell Kyle I came back around to his question. Beware the silo effect of social media. So Kyle brought up an important point, and that is the way that we dehumanize one another, right? Because you can't see another person on the end. You're like, I'll just make a little snarky comment here. You can't see face, you can't see tone, you can't say, just kidding. You know, the way that we dehumanize, that can happen pretty quickly. I'm really guilty of this. I try really hard to do a good job in digital spaces, but sometimes I do a digital eye roll and I say something hurtful and I shouldn't. There's a lot of repentance in my world on that part. But there's something else that's really important about what happens in social media. Now, just like cable news sources, what does Facebook see you as? You're the commodity. You're the product. No, they're not. You're not getting a free product. You're it. You are being bought and sold. And so what they want you to do is what they do for you is based on the things that you like. They continue to show you things. The algorithm, right? They begin to show you things that it thinks you will like, so that then you begin to see more and more things that are just what they call it curation, right? They're curating a selection of things for you. I've heard, I don't know if it's still true, I've heard on Facebook you can go in and look in your settings and like tells you like what political leaning it thinks that you are, and it will self-select. Kyle, I'm glad you came in because I'm talking about social media. I actually talked about it about 5 minutes, but we're kind of this idea of dehumanization. But I'm also talking about the silo effect of social media. And so by algorithm, particularly Facebook, but also Instagram and Twitter to some degree, they are curating your content, which means that they are perpetuating confirmation bias. Friends, you have to be aware of it, and you have to pay attention to what's happening, because so very subtly, your digital media, your social media, will begin to show you things that just help you believe what you already believe.
Creates an echo chamber.
An echo chamber, what a great word.
And they are resistant. They don't want it to change. They don't want you to pay for your service. They want you to be the commodity.
That's right. And I mean, you know, it's interesting to manage a social media page, Nazarenes United for Peace, and I can see what gets clicks. And sometimes it's low-hanging fruit to me to be like, oh, I'm going to generate some outrage with this. You know, I did it. Christian's wife, Emily, wrote a blog post for us on John MacArthur's Denigration of Women. She wrote an excellent blog post, Emily Reyes, if you want to look it up and read it. But I knew I was releasing at a time when it was like in the news. And guess what? Thousands and thousands and thousands of hits. Why? Because I knew that I could capitalize in a way on the outrage that was happening. Now, hopefully it was godly and put in the right direction. But this is how they treat you as a commodity. So beware the commodification of you in social media and the way that it is pushing you into your silos, right? So make deliberate efforts in your social media. If you're a heavy social media user, make deliberate efforts to be sure that you're being exposed to things that you do not agree with. Seek to understand the other side and find ways to see what God might be saying to you there. All right. So I just thought I'd land on questions without asking anything particular. I like the curiosity question, but I think I'll just simply ask a question. It's hard.
What would be your main advice for multicultural, how we can be more polite to people from another, it's not about only opinion, but some habits, some thoughts, some just, ways they even doing, going their life, how to be polite to people who, multicultural, in US especially, here in Kansas area, who come to our church.
Anybody have any ideas?
You have to study them. Study their culture, study the background. It's back to what I said earlier. Spend some time studying a person to know what they like, dislike, stuff like that, then you can influence their behavior. Now that takes time. You're not going to get it in 5 minutes. It takes time to study somebody. But our missionaries in the Church of Nazarene, they study a culture. Perhaps even learn the language, and they go over and they can better influence people to do something.
James, and I think we have to be done because I see folks waiting at the door. So James, jump in and then we'll wrap.
As far as getting along with people from other cultures and welcoming them, number one, don't presume anything. My wife is from Denmark, and people presume everything about her, like, for example, that Denmark's in Sweden, which it is. They presume so many things. Don't presume anything. Let them tell you about it.
Really great.
Become fascinated by other people. Become a fan of other people, and then they will warm to us automatically, and we will learn about them, and they will learn about us. And that's the biggest thing. Just be a fan of people.
I love that. What a great way to end. Friends, thank you for coming. Go in the grace and peace and hospitality of our Lord Jesus.